He walked into the luxury store wearing an old trench coat. And by the time he walked out, half the staff had either quit, cried, or begged him for forgiveness. But none of them knew he owned the entire chain. He wasn't just another old man passing through. He was the man who built it all from the ground up. That cold Friday morning in Manhattan, as sunlight danced across the polished windows of Fifth Avenue's most exclusive furniture store, Marquez Fine Living, Jeremiah Langston stood on the curb looking up at a brand he had quietly owned for over a decade. He didn't look like a millionaire. In fact, he didn't look like much at all. His coat was the same one he'd worn for years, a little faded, patched at one elbow. His black shoes were scuffed and out of style. He carried no designer bag, wore no watch, and held no smartphone. He had on a wool hat pulled low over his graying temples, and a soft calm in his eyes that most people overlooked. Jeremiah was 60 years old, black, and unassuming. 3 things that made people ignore him on the streets of New York. But what no one could see from the outside was that Jeremiah was also a real estate mogul worth tens of millions of dollars, who had spent the last 30 years quietly buying and restoring properties across Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens. While others chased flash and fame, Jeremiah had focused on substance and strategy. He didn't need recognition. He needed progress. And Marquez Fine Living was part of that legacy. His idea, his funding, his buildings. That day, he had come to see the store in person, to observe how things were being run, not as a boss, but as a silent visitor. The plan was simple. Walk in, browse a little, maybe speak to the staff without revealing who he was. He wanted to see if the values he built into his company still lived on inside the walls. But what greeted him instead was a reminder that judgment can be fast and brutal. As he reached for the door handle, just 2 minutes before the posted opening time, a man stepped between him and the entrance. The man was tall, built like a linebacker, and wearing a security uniform. His name tag read Raymond. He didn't smile. He didn't ask a question. He just said, "Sir, we're not open yet." Jeremiah nodded unfazed and replied, "That's all right. I'm just looking to step in out of the cold. I don't mind waiting inside." But Raymond didn't move. He looked Jeremiah up and down slowly, then said, "Look, this isn't a place to hang out. You need to keep it moving." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow, but stayed calm. "Excuse me." Raymond took a step closer and said more firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a high-end establishment. We don't allow loitering." Behind the glass doors, a few employees had started setting up for the day. A young woman named Haley glanced up from her tablet and noticed the interaction. She frowned but didn't move. Beside her, 2 other associates laughed quietly as they watched Raymond blocking the door. At that moment, Brenna, the assistant store manager, stepped into the scene. Tall, sharp, and perfectly dressed, Brenna walked like she owned the place. She opened the door just wide enough to step outside and folded her arms. "Is there a problem here?" Raymond said, "This gentleman is trying to come in early. Won't say what he wants. He's being persistent." Brenna looked Jeremiah over in one swift motion and said, "Sir, we don't allow loitering or panhandling on these premises. You're making my staff uncomfortable." Jeremiah let out a small sigh. "I'm not panhandling. I was planning to look around. That's all." Brenna's lips curled slightly. "This isn't the kind of place where people just look around. Everything here starts at 5 figures. If you're not here for a scheduled consultation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." From the sidewalk, a couple who had just finished a morning walk paused to watch. One of them pulled out a phone and started recording, perhaps sensing some kind of scene was unfolding. Haley inside the store looked even more uncomfortable now. She shifted her weight, glancing between Brenna and Raymond. She wanted to say something, but her voice caught in her throat. Meanwhile, another employee whispered, "This guy looks like he just walked out of soup kitchen." And they both laughed. But Jeremiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "I see," then slowly stepped back. As he walked toward the corner of the block, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small flip phone, the same kind most people hadn't used in a decade. He pressed a number from memory and waited for the answer. "Marcus," he said when the line clicked on, "I need you to bring the folder. Fifth Avenue. Right now." Then he hung up. No explanation. No drama. Just a quiet call and a look across the street as he waited. Inside the store, the employees laughed a little more. Brenna adjusted her blazer. Raymond stood proud of himself, and the morning resumed. But not for long. 35 minutes later, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled up in front of the store. Out stepped Marcus King, legal advisor to Langston Holdings, in a navy suit and polished Oxfords. He held a black leather folder with the company's gold insignia on the front. Jeremiah met him at the curb. They exchanged only a few words. Then they both turned and walked back toward the store. As the doors opened, Raymond moved quickly to intercept them again. "Gentlemen," he said, "I already told you." But Marcus raised a hand and said clearly, "We're here on business. Step aside." Raymond hesitated. But before he could say anything else, Marcus opened the folder and laid it on the central display table, directly beneath a chandelier valued at $40,000. Inside the folder were ownership documents, real estate titles, and corporate filings, all bearing the signature of one man, Jeremiah Langston. Haley gasped aloud. Brenna turned the color of paper. Raymond took a slow step backward. "This is a mistake," Brenna stammered. You never said who you were." Jeremiah looked at her steadily. "You never asked. You decided who I was before I opened my mouth." Raymond tried to speak, but Jeremiah turned to him. "Leave your badge with Haley. You're dismissed." Raymond opened his mouth again, but Marcus simply said, "It's final." Brenna began to protest, but Jeremiah cut her off. "You don't represent what the store is supposed to stand for. You represent everything we were supposed to change." Then he turned to Haley. "You're the only one who hesitated. That means something. As of today, you're the new assistant manager." Haley blinked in disbelief. "Sir, thank you. Just keep your heart open," he said, "and treat every person who walks through that door like they belong." As Jeremiah walked slowly through the showroom floor, his eyes scanned the furniture, the lighting, the displays. It all looked beautiful on the surface, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how people were treated, because that, he knew, was what luxury really meant. The days following the incident at Marquez Fine Living were unusually quiet in Jeremiah Langston's world. Not because there was a lack of media attention. Quite the opposite. The moment the footage from the security camera leaked, the internet did what it always does. It judged fast, loudly, and without filter. Multiple versions of the story were posted across social media platforms. Some edited to add dramatic music. Others slowed down to show Brenna's sneering face and Raymond's smug posture in excruciating detail. Headlines soon followed. "Old black man thrown out his own store. Real estate mogul teaches elitist staff a lesson in respect. He owned the building. They called him a bum." Within 48 hours, the story was viral across platforms. The general public reacted with outrage, praise, and disbelief. Some couldn't believe the staff had treated someone like that without asking a single question. Others were amazed at Jeremiah's poise. The most common comment across all platforms was a simple sentence. He didn't yell. He didn't flex. He just returned as the owner. Despite the internet storm, Jeremiah himself had remained completely silent. No statements. No press releases. No interviews. Instead, he returned to what he did best. Observing, listening, and quietly recalibrating. But inside Langston Holdings, the energy had shifted. Executives were uneasy, not because they were unsure where Jeremiah stood, but because they knew exactly what was coming. On the Monday following the incident, Jeremiah called a meeting on the 28th floor of his headquarters in downtown Manhattan. The boardroom was sleek and understated, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline and a single polished oak table stretching 12 feet long. Seated around it were his top executives, department heads, regional managers, HR leads, and his general counsel. Everyone knew something big was coming. They just didn't know how he would frame it. Jeremiah entered the room, wearing the same trench coat from that morning. He placed it on the back of his chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and then opened a black notebook. "I didn't call this meeting to fire anyone," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't call it to rant, or to shame people, or to throw anyone under the bus." There was a brief wave of audible relief. He looked around the room. "I called this meeting because we've lost our way. and I take responsibility for that. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Jeremiah continued, "When I started this company, it was never about marble floors or seven-figure revenue reports. It was about rebuilding places, homes, neighborhoods, cities. It was about giving dignity back to the spaces people lived and worked in. And somewhere along the way, we let luxury become more important than people." No one interrupted. "The store on Fifth Avenue is not the problem," he said. "It's a symptom. If people working under my name feel justified in humiliating a stranger for wearing the wrong coat, then we failed. Not just as a company, but as human beings." Then he laid out a sheet titled Dignity First, the Langston Holdings Cultural Reset. The plan wasn't symbolic. It was structural. First, every customer-facing employee across all Langston Holdings brands would be required to attend a 6-week dignity and inclusion training led by outside facilitators with expertise in bias, empathy, and cultural competence. These workshops would include role-playing, guest speakers, and real-time feedback sessions. Second, a new anonymous mystery shopper program would be implemented. These shoppers, hired from diverse backgrounds and dressed in a wide range of clothing styles, from business formal to casual streetwear, would visit each location monthly and report not on sales technique, but on how they were treated. Third, all executive bonuses would be partially tied to team culture and inclusivity metrics, not just financial targets. Stores with high customer respect ratings and zero discrimination complaints would be rewarded. Stores that failed, they'd get restructured. Finally, Jeremiah would personally visit one store per month. Unannounced, unrecognizable, observing, listening. From the back of the room, someone asked, "What if some staff push back?" Jeremiah looked up. "Then they don't belong here." The room fell silent again, not in fear, but in clarity. He wasn't doing this for headlines. He was doing this because the company's soul was at stake. That week, the first training program was launched. Haley, now officially the assistant manager of the Fifth Avenue store, was among the first to attend. She wasn't nervous. She was relieved. She had seen the damage that silence could do. For the first time in her short career, she felt like she was part of something that mattered. The training sessions weren't easy. Some staff cried. Others got defensive. Some quit. But for those who stayed, something began to shift. People started asking questions they'd never considered before. Why do we assume what wealth looks like? Why does someone have to look a certain way to be treated with basic respect? Why are we so quick to judge and so slow to listen? Haley noticed a change most in small moments. A guest walking in with an old coat wasn't ignored. A teenager browsing the lighting section wasn't followed suspiciously. A mother with 3 children wasn't dismissed as someone just wasting time. The store didn't lose its luxury appeal. If anything, it grew stronger. Customers who had once felt out of place now felt welcomed. And those who carried themselves with entitlement were gently reminded that kindness was the new brand language. Meanwhile, Jeremiah continued to move silently in the background. He visited stores in disguise. He watched body language. He spoke with janitors, baristas, and part-time clerks. He listened more than he talked. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for signs of change. Then, one evening, as he sat in his office reviewing customer feedback reports, his assistant brought in a small envelope. It was handwritten. No return address. The envelope simply said, "Thank you." Inside was a letter from a 17-year-old named Thomas Everett. Thomas wrote that he had seen the story online and couldn't stop thinking about it. He shared how, just 2 weeks earlier, he had been kicked out of the store in Queens while shopping for a birthday gift for his mother. He'd been wearing a hoodie. They assumed he was a shoplifter. The security guard had followed him around, then finally asked him to leave. He left without arguing, but inside, he felt humiliated. Then he saw Jeremiah's story. He watched how a man, disrespected in front of everyone, chose not to lash out, but to rise with grace. It inspired him. It gave him hope. He attached a few sketches of clothing designs he'd been working on. He said he dreamed of starting a brand one day that was about being seen, really seen, for who you are. Jeremiah read the letter twice. Then he called Marcus. "Find him," he said. I want to meet the kid." A week later, they met at a cafe in Brooklyn. Thomas arrived early, holding a worn backpack and shifting nervously in his seat. When Jeremiah walked in, Thomas stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "I didn't think you'd really come," he said. "You thought I'd ignore a letter like that?" Jeremiah replied. They talked for 2 hours. About dreams. About fear. About starting with nothing. Thomas showed him his sketches. Jeremiah asked questions, gave feedback. And when the bill came, he put down a business card and said, "Langston Holdings will cover your startup costs. But you're going to have to put in the work. This isn't a handout. It's a partnership." Thomas nodded, too stunned to speak. That moment for him changed everything. And for Jeremiah, it was a reminder that restoration didn't just happen in buildings. It happened in people, one by one, quietly, powerfully, and permanently. In the months that followed Jeremiah's quiet return to Marquez Fine Living, the culture inside Langston Holdings began to evolve, not just on paper, but in the hearts and actions of people across the company. The Dignity First initiative rolled out nationwide. Mandatory empathy workshops replaced generic corporate seminars. Leaders were challenged to unlearn what they thought they knew about service, professionalism, and power. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Something that could not be measured in spreadsheets. People were talking. They were asking new questions. At the flagship store on Fifth Avenue, a space once known for its polished perfection, an icy demeanor began to shift. Haley, now in her new role as assistant manager, set the tone. She implemented morning team circles, where staff shared short reflections before the doors opened. She invited speakers from local nonprofits to talk about poverty, housing insecurity, and the everyday experiences of people who didn't wear luxury brands. Some rolled their eyes at first. A few left, but most stayed and listened, and slowly, perspectives began to stretch. There was a moment one morning when a delivery man entered to the back door, drenched from rain, shivering and late. He'd forgotten his ID badge. In the past, he would have been ignored, maybe yelled at. But that day, a sales associate greeted him with a towel and a smile. Small acts, big change. Jeremiah continued his unannounced visits, this time not just to observe, but to engage. He sat with employees in break rooms. He ate lunch at community centers. He spent hours in small-town branches of his stores, listening to stories, frustrations, and suggestions. He wasn't there as a boss, but as a man trying to understand the world his company touched. He never introduced himself as the owner. He let the experience speak first. And slowly, his quiet presence became legend. People started whispering. Mr. Langston might walk in at any time, not to judge, but to see, to really see. Then one fall morning, Jeremiah received a call from the mayor's office. They invited him to speak at the upcoming NYC Leadership and Equity Summit, an annual gathering of government officials, business leaders, educators, and civic organizers. The request surprised him. Jeremiah was not a man who liked the stage. He preferred the back row, the shadowed seat, the quiet influence. But something about the invitation stirred him. Not because he wanted to be seen, but because maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't his anymore. Maybe it belonged to the countless others who never had the chance to walk back in as the owner. He accepted. The summit was held in a grand ballroom at the New York Public Library. Stained glass filtered the sunlight. Velvet seats filled row after row. Jeremiah stood backstage in the same old coat, his notes scribbled by hand, and waited for the cue. When his name was announced, most of the audience clapped politely. Some looked puzzled. A few whispered, "Is that the guy from the store story?" But when he began speaking, the room shifted. "A few months ago," he said, "I walked into one of my own stores and got treated like I didn't belong. Not because I said something wrong. Not because I broke any rules. But because I wore the wrong coat." A few murmurs echoed. Heads nodded. They didn't ask who I was. They didn't ask what I needed. They assumed, and their assumptions cost them more than they knew. He paused. "But I didn't come here to talk about that day. I came to talk about what we do next." He walked slowly across the stage. "You see, I had the power to walk back in and reclaim my space. But what about the kid in Queens who got followed in the store because he wore a hoodie? What about the elderly woman who gets ignored at the counter because she moves slowly? What about the immigrant who gets mocked for her accent while ordering a cup of coffee? The room grew still. Dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you are owed, just by being alive, just by being human. Someone in the second row wiped away a tear. The question is not whether bias exists. We know it does. The question is, what are we going to do about it when we see it? When we are it? He told them about Thomas, about Haley, about the delivery man in the rain, about the silent power of being seen. Real change, he said, doesn't come from hashtags or headlines. It comes from decisions. Small ones, daily ones, from people like you and me choosing to see, choosing to pause, choosing to act differently. He ended with a simple line. Luxury is not what you sell. It's how you treat people. The standing ovation lasted over a minute. After the speech, Jeremiah didn't wait for praise. He stepped off stage, shook a few hands, then quietly exited through a side door and walked alone down Fifth Avenue, unnoticed. But the story did not end there. 1 week later, Marquez Fine Living began working with a new nonprofit founded by Thomas Everett, now just 18. The nonprofit, named Seen and Heard, was dedicated to helping young entrepreneurs from underserved communities access mentorship, microfunding, and real-world business experience. Jeremiah funded it entirely but kept his name out of it. Thomas ran it passionately, with a board made up of young voices like his. One of the first programs paired high school students with stores across the city, including Marquez locations, where they would shadow employees, learn about retail customer service, and how to navigate spaces where they weren't always expected. The program exploded in popularity. Local news stations ran stories. Community leaders visited. Customers took notice. And the question changed from "Why are you here?" to "How can we help you grow?" Meanwhile, inside Langston Holdings, HR departments saw fewer complaints, but more internal conversations. Employees spoke up more freely when they witnessed unfair treatment. New hires came from more diverse backgrounds. And sales didn't drop, they increased, because customers began to trust a brand not just for its products, but for its principles. One day, a journalist finally convinced Jeremiah to sit down for a formal interview. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't televised. It was published in a quiet Sunday edition of a national business journal. When asked what drove him to respond with reform instead of revenge, Jeremiah answered with a story. "When I was a boy," he said, "my grandmother took me to a diner every Saturday. One day, a white man told us we were sitting at the wrong table. My grandmother looked at him and said, 'Child, we don't move unless it's towards something better.' That stayed with me. So when I got thrown out of my own store, I could have made noise. I could have sued. I could have fired everyone. But instead, I moved towards something better." The interviewer asked what he wanted his legacy to be. Jeremiah smiled. "I don't care if they remember my name. I care if they remember how they were treated, when no one thought they mattered." And that's exactly what began to happen. Across cities, states, industries, other companies reached out to Langston Holdings asking how to replicate the Dignity First model. School districts wanted training materials. Coffee shops wanted to send managers to workshops. Airlines requested consultations. What began as one man's quiet stand became a ripple across the country. It wasn't a movement with a banner or a slogan. It was something more honest, more lasting, a cultural correction born from a moment of stillness, humility, and clarity. And Jeremiah Langston, the man in the old coat, never needed a billboard or a trending hashtag. All he ever needed was a belief that if you lead with dignity, people will follow. A year had passed since Jeremiah Langston stood on the sidewalk of his own luxury store and was told he didn't belong. A full 12 months since he had quietly turned around, made a phone call, and set in motion a transformation that no one, least of all the staff at Marquez Fine Living, saw coming. In the time since, much had changed. But the man at the center of it all had not. Jeremiah still wore the same coat, still preferred handwritten notes to smartphone apps, still rode the subway when he didn't feel like being chauffeured, and still found peace in silence. But everywhere he went now, he was no longer invisible. He wasn't famous in the celebrity sense. His name wasn't screamed across gossip blogs or flashed on TV screens. But among those who followed business with conscience, community change, or simply good storytelling, he had become a kind of legend, a quiet architect of a better way to lead. In early October, Langston Holdings announced that they would be launching an annual Dignity Leadership Award to recognize individuals and organizations who had made measurable impacts on equity and empathy in their workplace. Jeremiah didn't name the award after himself. He refused. Instead, it would carry the name of his grandmother, Clara Langston Human Dignity Award, the woman who had once told him to never move unless it was towards something better. The first ceremony was to be held at the Brooklyn Museum, a place Jeremiah loved because it never shouted to be seen, yet held the weight of stories that couldn't be ignored. The night of the ceremony, the grand atrium was filled with people from all walks of life. Store managers, educators, community organizers, corporate leaders, and students. There was no red carpet, no designer showcase. Just a collection of humans dressed in what made them feel comfortable, standing in a space that had promised them only one thing. They would be seen. Jeremiah arrived without announcement. He slipped in through the side entrance, like always. A few recognized him and nodded respectfully. Others whispered and smiled, grateful just to be in the same room. He sat near the back, letting others take the spotlight. When the keynote speaker, Thomas Everett, now 19 and a founder of a growing nonprofit, stood up to address the room, Jeremiah's face remained calm, but his eyes gleamed with pride. Thomas spoke not with polish, but with purpose. He told the crowd about the day he got kicked out of a store for wearing a hoodie. He told them about writing a letter to a man he'd never met, and how that letter had changed the course of his life. He told them about his dream to build a world where no one had to prove they were worthy of respect. When he finished, he invited someone else to the stage, a woman with silver hair, dressed in modest clothes, her hands trembling slightly as she held a printed copy of a speech. Her name was Gloria Jenkins. She had once worked as a janitor in one of Jeremiah's early buildings before it had been remodeled. She told the audience how Jeremiah had always said hello to her, asked about her day, and brought her lunch when he saw she didn't have one. He never made me feel beneath him, she said, even though he owned the place and I cleaned the bathrooms. She looked out over the crowd. That's what dignity looks like. It's not fancy. It's not loud. It's consistent, quiet, steady. Jeremiah lowered his head. He hadn't expected to be spoken about. He never did. But stories like that were now surfacing everywhere. Not because he told them, but because others remembered. After the speeches, a plaque was unveiled on the museum wall. It was simple, elegant, and engraved with the words, "To be seen is to be valued. To be respected is to be free." This space honors those who choose dignity every day. And beneath it, in smaller letters, inspired by the work of Jeremiah Langston, the room stood in silence for nearly a minute. No one moved, because in that moment, they weren't applauding a man. They were honoring an idea, a principle, a call to live and lead with decency. Days later, Jeremiah was back to his normal routine. No fanfare. No headlines. He was walking through a small neighborhood in Queens, visiting a construction site for a mixed-income housing project he had funded years ago. It was nearly finished now. Fresh brickwork, wide sidewalks, green spaces designed for families. As he walked past the corner store, he saw a familiar face. Haley, now district manager of the Marquez brand in New York, was there with two new trainees. She spotted him and rushed over. "Mr. Langston," she said breathlessly, "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled. "I like to visit places before the ribbon cutting, when they still smell like fresh paint and hope." She laughed, then turned serious. "I wanted to thank you again, for everything, for trusting me that day when I didn't even trust myself." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't need to be loud. You just needed to notice. That's more than most do." Just then, one of the new trainees, a young man about 20 years old, approached. He looked at Jeremiah curiously. "Excuse me," he said. "I've heard your name before. You're the guy from that story, right?" Jeremiah smiled. "Depends on which story you mean." The trainee chuckled. "The one where they didn't know who you were and you owned everything?" Haley looked slightly embarrassed, but Jeremiah just nodded. Something like that. The young man grinned. That's a badass move, sir. I hope I can handle things like that one day. Jeremiah looked him in the eyes. You don't need to own the building to carry yourself like you do. You just need to remember that your presence has value, no matter where you stand. The trainee's grin faded into something more thoughtful. Thanks, he said quietly. I'll remember that. Jeremiah walked on, past the fresh concrete, the scaffolding, the teams putting in the final fixtures. He paused in front of a small community room built into the center of a development. A painted mural covered one wall. It showed people of all backgrounds standing together, lifting bricks, holding books, exchanging food, sharing space. And in the corner, almost hidden, was a man in a trench coat, holding blueprints, looking not at the camera, but at the people. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. Jeremiah looked at it, nodded once, and moved on. That night, he returned home to a small brownstone he'd lived in for over 30 years. The furniture was old but solid. The kitchen counters still had scuff marks from when he installed them himself. The window overlooked a street lined with trees he'd helped preserve through city funding. He sat in his armchair, opened his notebook, and wrote one final entry for the day. Today, someone remember my name. Tomorrow, someone may not. Either way, the work remains. And then he turned off the light. The city moved outside his window, unaware. But somewhere, someone was holding a door open differently. Someone was rethinking how they speak to a stranger. Someone was telling their child that being kind is not a weakness. That, in the end, was a legacy Jeremiah Langston built, not in towers or profit sheets, but in 1,000 small choices made by people who, because of him, finally understood what it meant to see and be seen. Stories like Jeremiah's remind us that dignity isn't about status. It's about how we treat one another when no one's watching. He didn't shout. He didn't fight back with anger. He led with quiet strength and changed everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about how we judge others, please give a thumbs up. It helps us share more stories that matter. And if you believe the world needs more compassion, more justice, and more moments of powerful transformation, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every week. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. This is Storytime with Jack. And remember, dignity is not something you earn. It's something everyone deserves.